I'd like to talk a little bit about Jane Austen's childhood and childhood in her novels, because that's the sort of the unifying theme of everything that we're presenting this evening. Jane Austen was born December 16th, 1775. For those of you who find that sort of thing interesting, that makes her a Sagittarius. And just to put it in its historical context, 1775 was the year that the American Revolution began. It was also the year that the Battle of Quebec was fought, and the Americans lost. So that's sort of the Canadian kind of context to what was happening the year that Jane Austen was born. It was also the year that Turner was born, the painter Turner. And just a tiny little tidbit that I think Austen herself might have found kind of interesting. In 1775, invisible ink was invented by Sir James Jay. Didn't know that, did you? Getting back to England, where Jane Austen was born, this is the reign of George III. That would be the mad one, as in the madness of King George. That's the one, George III. So you've probably heard the period, Jane Austen's period, referred to as the Regency period. The reason for that is that in consequence of George III's recurring bouts of madness, something that we now believe was due to a hereditary disease called porphyria, his son, who would eventually become George IV, was forced to rule in his stead, thus becoming the Prince Regent, and that's why the period is referred to as the Regency. Now, technically, the actual Regency was only from 1811 until 1820, after which time, when George III eventually died, his son took the throne and became George IV. However, in referring to the Regency era, it often makes reference to a broader period of approximately 1795 to 1837, 1837 being, of course, when Queen Victoria came to the throne. So this is the world into which Jane Austen was born. An interesting little tidbit about Jane Austen's connection to the Prince Regent is that she was kind of coerced into dedicating one of her novels, Emma, to the Prince Regent, much against her will. She was not a fan of the Prince Regent, as many people were not. He was not exactly a popular guy. And in fact, she sympathized greatly with his wife, who became his ex-wife, and really would rather not had to dedicate the book to him, but it was suggested to her that it wasn't just an invitation, it was a necessity. When the Prince Regent asks you to dedicate a book to him, you don't say no. So, Jane Austen's family. Her mother was Cassandra Austen. She was born Cassandra Lee, and she was born into an aristocratic family. So when she married George Austen, Jane Austen's father, she was in a sense taking a step slightly down into a lower social echelon, into the gentry. However, as far as we know, this didn't seem to faze her. Everything that we know of Jane Austen's mother suggests that she was a very practical, down-to-earth, sensible woman with an excellent sense of humor, which Jane Austen, I don't want to say inherited, but certainly learned. And she, as the wife of a minister at the time, her duties included overseeing the household, and that included keeping an eye on her husband's boarding pupils, because he was also a tutor in addition to being a minister for the two parishes, the parish of Steventon and the neighboring parish of Dean. So it was a very busy household, particularly as Jane Austen was the seventh of 8 children. So there were a lot of people packed into this cottage that the family lived in. I'm using the word cottage a little bit flexibly, I suppose, depending on your modern standards of what cottage is. So the order of the siblings went as follows. The eldest was James, and James would eventually follow in his father's footsteps and become the Reverend James Austen. The second son was George, and George is kind of the sad story in what's generally kind of a happy narrative of the Austen family. George had some sort of disability. We're not certain exactly what it was, but we do know that he had fits. He may have been deaf. And unfortunately, this was the norm at the time. He was therefore sent to live with another family and basically ceased to have any contact, as far as we know, with his family. And again, this was kind of a societal norm for what was done in a case like this where the child had some kind of fairly serious disability. Next in line was Edward, and the interesting story about Edward is that later on, he was into his teens at this point, he was actually adopted, in a sense, by some distant relatives called the Knights, the Knight family. They were wealthy and childless and needed an heir. And they took a fancy to young Edward and basically asked if they could kind of adopt him into their family as the heir. And this met with agreement on both sides. Edward certainly did not lose contact with the rest of the family. In fact, he was the one who later in Jane Austen's life was able to offer her and her mother the cottage at Chawton, where they could live out the rest of their life. Next down we have Henry. Henry was the scholarly one, scholarly and clever and witty, and he later managed some of the publication of Austen's novels. Next in line is Cassandra. And Cassandra, I don't think you can possibly overstate her importance in Jane Austen's life. She was Jane's only sister, and the two were extremely close. They shared a room throughout their lives. Most of what we know about Jane Austen's personal life comes from the letters that she wrote to Cassandra when they were apart. That would be the letters that Cassandra didn't destroy. Many Austen scholars and fans are just, shall I say, irate, or at least lament the fact that Cassandra burned them. But it's certainly likely that she did that in accordance with Jane Austen's own wishes, so we can't really hold it against her. Next in line was Francis, or Frank, who eventually went into the Navy and he became an admiral. Then Jane, and finally Charles, the baby of the family whom Cassandra referred to as our own particular brother. So those were the 8 children, and they were born in pretty quick succession between 1765 and 1779. So we presume that Mr. and Mrs. Austen were getting along pretty well throughout those years. And one other really significant fact about the children in the Austen family is that the Austens were fortunate enough not to lose a single child in infancy or childhood, which was pretty remarkable for those days considering the infant mortality rates. So they must have been doing something right. One interesting thing they did do, and again this was not unusual in families of a higher standing, was that after the baby was weaned, they would send the child to live with a country family for a couple of years until he or she could walk and talk and basically be civilized and fit into the family lifestyle. This doesn't mean that they lost contact with them. One or both parents, we think, went to see them probably nearly every day. But this was kind of a routine procedure that was followed with children in those early years. Now, Jane Austen spent much of her childhood at home. This was certainly not unusual for a girl. In fact, it's more unusual that she did go to school than that she spent the rest of those years at home, because schooling for girls was kind of a luxury. Girls didn't really need to be schooled, because let's face it, they were supposed to get married and have children. So schooling was kind of a luxury on top of that. The Austen family, being the educated literary types that they were, decided that they did want to school their daughters, and so Jane and Cassandra went off to school together. Now, Jane was very young at this time. She was only 7 when we first went, 6 actually, I think. And she went because basically she wanted to do anything that Cassandra did. In fact, her mother is quoted as having said, if Cassandra were going to have her head cut off, then Jane would have to have hers cut off too. So that kind of gives us a sense of the relationship between the 2 girls. So they went off to an Oxford boarding school run by a woman called Mrs. Colley with their cousin, Jane Cooper. Unfortunately, something rather tragic happened, which is that Mrs. Colley decided to move her school to Southampton, and at the new school there was an outbreak of typhus. Typhus, also known at the time as putrid fever, is, you'll probably remember it as the same illness that the girls get at school in Jane Eyre. And this was a very serious illness, and all the girls came down with it. For some reason, Mrs. Colley didn't think it was serious enough to inform their parents, Fortunately, Jane Cooper did think so, and she wrote to her mother telling her how sick they all were, and Mrs. Austen and Mrs. Colley swiftly went to the school to fetch their daughters. The tragic part that I mentioned, fortunately Jane pulled through, although she was very, very ill. Mrs. Cooper caught typhus from her daughter, so even though all the three girls survived, Jane Cooper's mother died from typhus. So after that, the girls didn't go to school again until 3 years later in 1785, when they went to the Abbey School in Reading, and they stayed there for 2 years. It seems from what we know of this period that they had a pretty easy time of it at this school. They did do some lessons, but they also had a lot of free time. It was quite a picturesque setting. There was the ruins of an old abbey nearby. Apparently there had even been a shriveled up hand found somewhere on the grounds of the abbey, which was thought to be perhaps a saint's relic of some sort. And it was run by a colourful woman called Mrs. Latournelle. Mrs. Latournelle was not, in fact, Mrs. Latournelle. She was Sarah Hackett, but she had decided to take on this French name and identity in order to raise the, exoticness of her school. And she was also kind of interesting because she had a cork leg that she would never say how she had lost her original leg. So she was pretty interesting. Once the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Austen, figured out that actually the girls weren't really doing too much at school, they decided that it was an unnecessary expense, and so they brought them home. So that brief period was the only time that Jane and her sister were away receiving any outside schooling. Other than that, they were educated solely at home. What made Jane Austen's home schooling, as it were, somewhat different perhaps than that of other girls of her time, is that she was given free rein to read anything she wanted in her father's very extensive library of hundreds of volumes. And there really were no restrictions on what she could read. So in addition to reading sound-wise, she read the Bible and Shakespeare and good stuff like that. She also read more lurid Gothic novels. She read The Monk. She read a lot of Samuel Richardson. We know that she read Tom Jones. So she was reading some fairly improper, if you wish, literature and really getting quite a broad education for a girl of